Palingenesis by Simon Hereward. Book 1. Progeny of Hate. Chapter 9. Death Among the Trees. Lund moved ever so slightly to relieve his cramping muscles. A quick assessment reassured him that no bones were broken. That, at least, was some indication that they valued his life and had no use for him in a crippled or maimed state. The pain was merely a result of bruises and lacerations caused by the beating they had given him. Of course, they had been aware of his killing the beaters. They may even have been slightly pleased by it, but he had to be shown that such actions invoked their anger. The greater the skill and the threat posed by the runner, the greater the esteem for the hunter when it was overcome. If a particular runner showed promise, a hunter might decline the opportunity of taking its life when it was cornered, and merely take a finger or ear as a trophy instead, thus allowing it to develop its skills. Eventually it would be released during a royal hunt, its virtues extolled and exaggerated, to honor the hunter of royal blood who would overcome it. There had been many runners in the past to survive 10 hunts or more, only to perish in a royal hunt, where the strongest were weakened by withholding their food. It would be unseemly for the sometimes less capable royal party to fail in locating all the runners and bringing back their heads as trophies. The only hope for a runner to survive more than a few seasons was to hone his fighting skills to the point where he would be selected to serve in the arena. Kor did not approve of this line of thought, since there was no escape from the arena. He held that a runner had the only chance of ever breaking out and evading the trackers. One should become familiar with the ways of the forest, bide one's time, build up sufficient strength and stamina, and survive for the opportunity presented by a royal hunt. Lund did not share this view. It was futile thinking of escape. Hunts were well planned and executed. The outer ring of beaters had to be broken at some point, and when this occurred, the hunters and trackers were aware of it. Hounds would be employed against the poor runner who did not turn at the sounding of the end-of-day horn, and even if he could somehow give these the slip, he would then have to contend with an endless unknown forest, hunger, wild animals, and the traps set especially to prevent his escape. No, the best policy for survival was the fighting pits. There were tales of men who had lasted for 10 cycles in the arena. The best of runners had endured for no more than 14 or 15 10-days, once released into the hunting trails. Fighting men were also trained and well-fed. Some were selected for breeding, far more frequently than the odd runner who might possess some exceptional skill. Every uprising that had ever been had originated from the fighting men. This was certainly the avenue of survival, and ultimately of revenge. Lund did not intend to survive merely for the entertainment of his masters, or the gaining of more privileges. No, his motivation sprang from his boiling hate for the oppressor, and the possibility of paying back in kind. Freedom was a foreign notion he could not grasp or own. What did it mean beyond the annihilation of the tyrant? As soon as the familiar echoing drip told him where he was, he stirred and opened his eyes. They had dumped him on the stone floor, as was their custom, and not bothered to take a step or two further and drop his limp form on the rancid straw.
They are not watching you.
He rolled onto his stomach and drew his protesting body into a crouch. Instead of attempting to rise to his feet, though, he crawled over to the pallet. Slowly, so as not to cause a fresh issue of blood from his back, he lowered himself onto his stomach. Within 9 days he would be back in the forest. he would give his body every opportunity to recover.
Have they spared your legs?
Yes,
That is a good sign. You are more fortunate than you deserve.
you have told me before.
They will leave you for 2 days at least. Do not move unnecessarily. I will send urine with food and salt for the cuts. You can sleep on your own?
Yes. Koi,
What is it?
I am sorry about the beaters. I could not control.
Rest. Perhaps you have acquired some wisdom.
Luren was small for his 12 cycles, but even so would soon find it impossible to reach all the cells in the training crypts. He had appeared from the duct, out of breath, and wide-eyed, waiting and listening hard before removing the middle bar of the grill and twisting through into the semi-darkness of the cell. Lund knew he was training to become a runner. His size did not impress enough to send him to the fighting pits. He was quick and clever, though, sufficiently agile for Kor to use in the ducts. Lund did not stir as the boy knelt beside him, only grimaced silently at the sharp intake of breath. The cuts across his back had to be a gruesome sight indeed. Luren handed him a curved talon knife to replace the one he had dropped after being taken in the forest. His eyes were still wide, his expression conveying the pity to which he could give no words. Lund placed the blade between his teeth and clamped them down hard as the slightly trembling fingers worked the salt into the lacerations on his back. Even so, he had to do his utmost not to let a sound escape him. A slow fire flowered through his flesh, gaining in intensity till it seemed to pulse in every part of his body. Ere long the perspiration ran between the clenched fingers of his hands, making the palms slippery. Before sliding back through the grill, the boy left several hard black loaves and some fruit in the customary place, within easy reach but out of sight. The keepers never entered a cell unless it would be to drag away a body. Lund had managed to grip Luren's arm in passing, and squeeze it fleetingly as the only means of expressing his gratitude. All too soon the boy would himself be in need of such aid. Now he willed himself out of consciousness and pain, as Kor had taught him, without the debilitating power of a sleeping drug that would only slow down the healing on which his future survival depended. He took up the rhythm of the dripping water, the beating of his heart, the steady pulse of the pain. Soon it became one with his breathing, allowing him to slip between into forgetfulness. The boy came twice more during the next 5 days. Each time he brought more food, which Lund forced himself to eat, in addition to the daily rations shoved through the door of his cell. The healing was quick and clean, and though he had been pulled back into labor on the 3rd day, he had to feign greater weakness than he actually felt. The runners were commonly employed in less strenuous work, and fed better than the norm. Moreover, they were in training every other day, which, though not precluding the generous use of the lash, was aimed at improving the physical condition. Lund formed part of a general-purpose work party, used for any task at hand. Presently they were set to repairing the ox carts used for transporting the steady flow of foodstuffs to the north. The light work gave him the perfect opportunity to regain his strength and dream fruitlessly of escaping his cursed world hidden aboard one of these heavy carts. Yet it was widely rumored that whatever the mysterious northern passage conducted to its unknown destination would simply end up on some banquet table in another clearing, be it produce of the soil or fattened slave. Moreover, the drivers of these carts were men from outside his clearing, whose language he could not discern as easily as the guttural prattle of the keepers, since he was hardly ever exposed to it directly. Vran slaves were never allowed near the laden carts either, for fear that they might appropriate some of the produce of their labors. To be caught near the supply carts would be instant death, if not a prolonged agony for the sport of the guards. Escape along this route would remain a pleasant daydream. 2 days before the next hunt, he was herded into the running trails to a noticeable stir of excitement among the runners. The rumors spread like wildfire. A new master had arrived to replace Ishtar Greytooth. An over-eager youth of about 17 cycles whispered the details to him before a guard cuffed him back into silence. Vron were not allowed the luxury of speech, for it could perchance embolden them to imagine themselves more than the animals they were. Lund glanced at the youth, who grinned back at him despite the blood trickling from his lower lip. He felt for the boy's mind as a matter of course, half hoping there would be some relationship close enough for communication, but no familiar whispered thought answered the unspoken question. He resigned himself to an almost imperceptible nod, before turning his thoughts into himself. The rhythmic footfalls of the training run soon imposed their order upon his mind. So the brutish beater of females and small children had given up his rule of 8 cycles. It was a pity in a way, for it would have supplied Lund with immeasurable contentment to see the over-large, red-eyed Torque squirm at the end of a metal pike. The reason for his departure was a mystery. He had shown no signs of weakness or strained nerves during his tenure, like his predecessor had. Far from it. His cruelty and enjoyment of inflicting suffering had only seemed to deepen with time. Perhaps he was needed in one of the farming areas to step up production or stamp out any sign of dissent. For Lund, it was an occasion for rejoicing. His replacement was an unknown quantity, but would not remain so for long. The men in the fighting pits would soon probe his abilities and weaknesses. Depending on the results, plans, seasons in the making, would be executed. At the thought of it, his tread lightened, and he felt the ripple of strength through his shoulders. Now was the time to be selected for the pits. In his short life there could very well be no further opportunity. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the canopy in long, bright fingers, bathing shrubs and patches of the leaf-strewn forest floor in vivid gold. Black butterflies flitted here and there, occasionally touching the slanted beams with their dark velvet wings. A particularly large one settled for a moment on a low bough, recently stripped of leaves and twigs, and worked its wings back and forth. Then, for no apparent reason, it darted away into the deep shade of a gnarled milkwood, where it took up the erratic rhythm of its winged dance once more, perched on the soiled round of a human knee. Lund lifted his gaze from the antics of his tiny visitor back to the telltale limb. It was still young and springy, bent at an unnatural angle and secured out of sight, no doubt prepared with sharpened stakes or spikes to inflict a debilitating wound on the unsuspecting or careless victim. He could almost sense the tension in the limb, the pent-up maiming power seeking an opportunity to unleash itself, like the latent violence inside him, a constant menace. And yet he had remained sober and restrained this day, as carefully concealed and bridled as the devious trap before him. He had heeded the voice of Kor in his mind, stayed clear of beater and hunter, which was quite possible in the southern reaches of the forest in which they had been released this time, especially if one had the advantage of a seer as he had. Even so, the southern hunting wedge seemed darker, wetter than the other 4, with more opportunity to evade pursuers. He looked down at his limbs and the ragged remains of his tunic, covered in layers of thick dark slime from some boggy patch. The musty smell of it had faded by now, for it had hardened almost to a second skin, stiffening his joints. He shifted his position in the deep shade, sending the butterfly darting away, and his body seemed suddenly more than just an extension of the rough bark and roots of the tree. Then he froze. Some 20 yards away, a dark shape broke one of the strands of sunlight. It was a hunter. The ray of light played over hardened leather greaves and bracers, impenetrable chest plate and full helmet, as well as a large crossbow with a hunting bolt latched and ready. The figure moved noiselessly, its tread measured and slow, so as not to betray its presence to the prey. A paralyzing cold draped itself over Lund, and he had to stifle a gasp of horror with the utmost control.
Cool. Remain still.
You did not sense him?
No. He's powerful. Perhaps beyond me. Perhaps he knows some trick.
The figure had halted in a pool of shade just beyond the stringed light, his head slightly cocked, the dark armor melding with the gloom, obscuring the lines of his form. Lund kept his breathing shallow, as if any slight movement of his chest might give him away. He knew well that the sight of these Torque hunters could penetrate the darkness even better than his own, for they were creatures of the dark, whose very souls were cold as night and cruelty. Their people enjoyed the sinister and treacherous promise of unfathomable deep places, and performed their darkest rites in pits and passages far beneath the surface, or under the dim light of the twin star which they worshipped. Their very presence exuded fear and horror, since their appetite for inflicting pain seemed insatiable. This fear Lund could feel now, staring at the powerful shape before him. His heartbeats quickened till he could feel the blood pulsing through his body, and he became alarmed that this predator might hear or feel it also. But perchance it did. Perchance it merely toyed with him, savoring the terror of its victim. There was a sense of shame now, which deepened and then exposed his anger and loathing. The raw hatred washed over him, clouding his mind, scores of voices screaming for vengeance. He slowed the mad beating of his heart. The small curved claw of the metal inside his tunic suddenly waxed potent, cold and heavy against his skin.
Don't move.
Kor's thought, with the signature awareness of his presence, was almost painful in its intensity.
There will be time for this.
Lund knew the voice had to be right in what it claimed, but there was no stopping the hand that inched meticulously towards the fold of fabric, concealing his only weapon. The muscles in his legs tensed in anticipation. As if it had sensed the slight movement, or perhaps the threat and presence of the prey, the hunter turned its head slowly to the left, till it faced in Lund's direction. Then it paused, allowing the eyes time to discern and evaluate the intertwined forms of roots and branches. Lund halted the movement of his hand, and imperceptibly lowered his eyelids, observing the predator through a slight blur of the lashes. The shoulders were coming round now, to follow the turning of the head. Lund's pulse quickened again. He waited for the hunter to take one step, then he would grasp the claw and rush. Clear and insistent, despite its apparent distance, a hunting horn sounded. Then 2 more blasts followed, closer at hand. A quarry had been sighted. In a blur of motion the hunter disappeared through the foliage. His dash was eerie in its stillness, with hardly a leaf moving at his passage. Lund relaxed his tense frame and slowly let out his breath. The intense relief he felt left him drained and weak. Never had he been this close to a stalking hunter and certain death. There could have been no other result for the unequal struggle with an armored and trained Torque warrior. His escape was nothing short of miraculous. Kor had no answers for him. After he had been flung back into the cell that night, they conversed for some time, in an attempt to find some explanation for the hunter's ability to evade the detection of a seer.
They are kin to us in some way, and just as our own close kinship would allow a sense and awareness of each other, this one may sense your intention of harm, or even your fear.
Lund was not in the habit of questioning the old man's judgment, but he could not believe that there was some link between him and the filthy Torque hunters other than hatred.
What trick could he have used?
He has a strong mind, and if he is aware of the presence of a seer, he could mask his intentions, and thus the threat he poses may not be perceptible in a hunting ground. There are many threats distracting me, notably the trap you are hiding next to. This might have aided him.
The unfamiliar skill of this hunter and the uncertainty it engendered held Lund in fitful sleep that night. He awoke several times trembling and sweating with fear, nor did his nervousness abate the next day. It was a working day, and he joined a group carting away small mountains of dark soil, the result of the Torque's endless tunneling. It was mindless work, requiring virtually no concentration, and he had time enough to think. It was clear that Kor's strategy for survival and ultimately for escape would not succeed. True, he had lasted through 4 hunts, but he also knew that he would not have lived through the first of it, had it not been for the old man's assistance. Now a single hunter had breached his defenses. Either Kor was failing, or he could not protect his chosen runner from all the dangers he would have to face. Even if he could, there was no telling when the royals would venture into the hunting trails again to satisfy their lust for blood. Would he even get the opportunity to escape before he ran into another potent hunter? The very best of runners, Sinath, had not been able to slip away, though he had run in 3 royal hunts. Since he could not be tracked and killed for more than 60 hunts, and had accounted for 13 beaters during that time, they had prepared a special end for him. He had been hunted in relays for 3 days and nights, till hunger and fatigue had reduced him to an easy prey. Now his head was a trophy in some cavern. Would he not eventually share such a fate? The sun was setting at last, and soon it would be comfortably dark, with the potent gaze of Horan in Ronag the principal illumination for all living. Sabran, master of Grail but for 3 days, relished the moment. He was somewhat fairer of complexion than the majority of his race, a quality that seemed to be accompanied by a lesser tolerance for the baleful light of Imran's orb. The soothing dark and pale starlight made it easier for him to sift through the muddle of experiences and thoughts on what had confronted him almost as soon as he had arrived. How the wretched slaves had learned so quickly that the new master was in residence was a mystery to him, yet they had prepared their actions for the very 10th day of his arrival. And well prepared they had been, designed to test his authority in public, where his opportunity for reprisal was subject to the scrutiny and opinions of his subordinates and guests. This pressure had angered him at the time, and yet he had not lost control and ordered a mindless slaughtering. Such action would have depicted him as a simple brute, and he was so much more than that, so much more. He could still feel the embarrassment, though, as if the slave's behavior could be attributed to his presence alone, as if his apparent weakness had incited them to such open flaunting of authority. He could even hear the strained excitement in the voice of his chief overseer, Groth, as he offered an explanation for the sullen, motionless forms in the arena. Had he been excited at the prospect of seeing the slaves humbled, or his new master fail?
They suspect. No one will fight in the arena. They just stand to be slaughtered.
It had been an appeal for action, as if the big thug had never dealt with such situations before, as if there had been only one person among all that host of overseers and guards who could have broken the sudden strange resistance of the fighters below. Of course he had been in doubt as to what course of action he should have followed. He had hated the eyes of all these spectators on him, as if they had been judging him by how he would proceed, and that tension had affected his ability to think clearly. For a moment he had faltered, but that had only fueled his anger, and his will had imposed clarity of thought.
Release some of those tigers you showed me earlier.
He had made an attempt at sounding disinterested, even slightly annoyed at this obvious oversight of his subordinate.
That should stir them to action.
He smiled to himself even now at the memory of Groth's somewhat mortified obedience, and his own relief as the crowd had turned their attention back to the arena soon after. These slaves would quickly learn that Zabrin of Munborg was no one to be toyed with, or even to annoy. He had come here for one reason only, to find another stepping stone for his career, to please Horan himself by the swift and efficient execution of his task. It was a pity, in a way, for it would have been a challenge to run these slave colonies in a manner that would have put Ishtar in the shadow. As it was, he had but a few short seasons before the very existence of this place would no longer be required. Steps behind him made him turn away from his deep thoughts. It was Groth once more, still not quite sure of Zabrin's abilities to govern, yet deeply respectful. Perhaps he could sense more than what was on the surface to see. Perhaps some deep intuition told him that this master was of a potency about which the likes of Ishtar could only dream. This would account for his uncertain tone, as if he were a novice, and not the great burly veteran of over 10 cycles in Grail.
My lord, forgive me for disturbing you. It is the matter of the fighting men. Is there some special instruction regarding them?
The overseer knew better than to use his initiative in an issue as important as this one. Zabrin gave the orders he had had time to formulate without the slightest hesitation, yet he was careful not to seem over-eager. His subordinate would not see him considering a way of action again.
Withhold their food for 5 days, and give them small quantities of water only. At sunset on the 5th day, select 2 whom you consider to be ringleaders, and lash them to within an inch of their lives. Do this in front of the others, and make sure you give no reason for the punishment.
Groth looked at him quizzically.
No executions?
His pretense at a respectful tone had evidently suffered a severe blow.
No mutilated bodies on display?
I am not Ishtar, Groth, and I do not need to imitate his style.
Groth made no reply. His frown had deepened. Zabrin continued.
We have to break their solidarity, make them fear and distrust each other, or they will only gain strength from our cruelty. I have seen this before.
He smiled. It was quite apparent from Groth's expression that he had not credited his new master with much experience. Was it possible that he might enjoy these few seasons of playing at slaves and masters? It would be an excellent diversion from the grim task he had come to perform. Lund realized with a sudden dismay what degree of strength he had previously derived from the hope of an eventual escape. Even if he had not directly believed in it, the possibility had given him an energy he now sorely lacked. It was barely noon, with several hours of the hunt still remaining in the long sun-tide day, and he was close to exhaustion. He realized, too, that his fear of the hunter he had so mysteriously encountered on the previous 10th day still lurked in the back of his mind, and clouded his judgment and instincts. He halted briefly in a dark overgrown gully, where the air lay thick and unmoving, laced with the overpowering scent of the small but intensely fragrant purple verdal blooms. This he now drew deeply and slowly into his burning lungs, in an effort to regain control over his breathing, which, for the past hour, had been no more than the gasps of a worn-out and winded animal. He backed himself against a tree, closing his eyes, awaiting the inevitable. And there it was.
You cannot linger.
How far?
Less than a mile.
His sigh was but shallow, or perhaps only happened in his mind, for he still gulped the sweet air as a glutton at a feast of the gods. This day had been a near disaster from the very beginning. He had had the ill luck of being spotted during the first sweep of the beaters. That initial chase had been intense and draining, since most of the beaters now knew him by sight, and had him singled as a priority target. He had dared to kill some of their number, had brought fear to their hearts, and thus had to be destroyed for the sake of their pride. They had swung their half-circle of detection after him with haste, correcting its orientation whenever he was spotted attempting to slip out past one of the flanks. It was impossible to become invisible again after they had latched onto him, and his only hope was to stay beyond their reach till sunset. Could he double back and attempt to break their line like he had done before? He knew that they were warned as to his presence now, and clumped together in groups of 5, since he had so easily scattered 3 of them 10 days before. Could he manage 5? Would they not merely occupy him till that undetectable hunter arrived to collect his head? It was hopeless. As he tiredly trudged off again, some of the fatigue transferred itself from his bones to his spirit. He deliberately allowed his mind to explore that numb despair he forever struggled against. Mayhap it would be better to die quickly, with that murderous bolt he had seen in the crossbow the previous 10th day through his chest, than to live with the constant pain and fear. He was no champion, no savior that could break out to some fantastic world beyond the trees and find a means of rescuing his cursed people from their oppressors. He was as hopeless and helpless as the weakest child among them, only drawing breath at the whim of his masters, and preserved for their entertainment. Why participate in this mad dance of death, when he knew beforehand that there was ultimately no survival for him? Why not merely stop the silly running and await the unavoidable? He paid little attention now to where he was going or where he put his feet. His tread was heavy with dejection and careless. He rolled his mind in a blanket of misery, and therefore heard no warning till his own perception picked up the sudden sweep of released tension and the swift pain that followed. He stared dumbly at his own blood as it instantly coated the fanged bough that had become, for an odd moment, a part of him. The crimson spilled over shyly to drip on the ground, then swelled to flow in an irresistible tide from the impact in his thigh, over his trembling knee and shin. It engulfed the manacle with its cloth-wrapped link of chain. He felt it warmly embrace his ankle. Only when it joined the first sprinkled offering on the ground did he become aware of the searing pain. It brought him rudely to his senses. He heaved the spiked limb out of his flesh and twisted away without looking at it. The image of the bloodied teeth would only serve to wear down his resolve in the long hours to follow. He hobbled some 10 paces, propped his back against a tree, and slid down till he sat with his injured leg outstretched. He pressed down with his palms to staunch the flow of blood, but he could not remain thus for long, since the beaters would undoubtedly quicken their pace once they were alerted to his present weakness, and he should be far by then. He breathed deeply again, trying to make use of the forced break in his running. It was strange how this injury had removed all thought of surrender. The sight of his blood had brought to the fore his fervent desire to survive, for whatever uncertain future. That his survival would seemingly serve only for the amusement of the oppressor mattered little. He ripped the top half of his sleeveless tunic into strips, and wrapped these as tightly as he dared round his right thigh. There were 2 wounds, the larger and more serious about halfway up and to the side, the smaller just above the knee. He leaned back for a moment and closed his eyes.
Half a mile. I'm ready.
He used the trunk behind him for a support as he rose slowly to his feet. His wrapped thigh throbbed dully, but as he put more weight on it there was little pain, and the flow of blood seemed to have ceased. He took a few tentative steps, testing the limb. Then he strode off purposely, forcing himself not to limp. There was no pain now, and he was concerned for a moment whether the trap had been poisoned or not. But then poison had availed the torque little in the past, since the beasts they hunted had been only slightly affected by it. Lund was ready to combat any of the familiar symptoms of poisoning, for this he had done several times before. He broke into a light run, ignoring the sharp protest from his leg. and felt for the rhythm of breathing, the slow, comfortable pattern that prevailed during training.
Keep in a straight line. Stay ahead till nightfall. They are angry.
Hunters?
I see none as yet.
Lund knew that the horns would be sounded soon enough to summon the hunters to the final chase, as soon as they found the place his blood had been spilled. He quickened his pace. The hours ground by too slowly. At some stage his wounds had opened again and recommenced the awful leeching away of his life. He drained his strength away till he could not determine any more whether his pace was fast or slow. The throbbing pain numbed his mind and blurred his vision, so that he often broke through the shrubbery instead of swerving round. Kor's constant voice kept him moving in the right direction, as well as informing him about the pursuit. Yet he hardly seemed to comprehend these thoughts any more, and they grew increasingly distant and unimportant till they moved him almost on impulse only, and were reduced to the single syllables of left or right. Somewhere in his mind he was considering the whole situation from a distance. He thought about the extensive damage it was doing to the muscle of his thigh. He wondered how it would be possible to be anything more than a cripple if he should survive till the next hunt. He was even slightly irritated that the sun was so slow in setting this day. At some stage the edges of his vision turned dark, and he realized that he would soon lose consciousness. The trail of blood he had left behind made it impossible to hide. He would soon be at bay, unable to defend himself.
Stop.
The command was like the taste of cool water. He wondered if he had imagined it, but obeyed instantly, his body slumping forward so that he had to grab hold of a tree in order not to fall. He held onto the rough bark with both arms and closed his eyes for a moment. He dragged his mind from the brink of forgetfulness.
Kor?
They have halted. They are uncertain.
Why?
The hunters are angry. They are 2 miles behind and not gaining. No prey has been sighted all day. They have come too far in this futile chase.
What should I do?
Stay where you are. You have almost reached the line.
This news was enough to rouse him from his semi-consciousness. The line! Hardly a runner had ever achieved such a feat, even with 2 healthy legs. Yet he knew there was no passing this barrier at speed. Stretching for perhaps half a mile, the torque had planted a thicket of thorny, near-impenetrable shrub, beyond which lay who knows what devious set of traps. This time not to maim, but to kill. Given enough time and a healthy, rested body, he could attempt a passage through the barricade, but as things were, it would be futile. The last strands of gold had faded from beneath the canopy, and the cool of evening now crept into the deeper shadows. Lund seated himself with his back to the tree, and stretched out his legs with care. Soon the injured one would stiffen, making it difficult to move. He thought with dread of the many miles he would have to cover back to his cell before he could hope to find some rest. For a moment he appreciated his close escape. Had the beaters any idea how near he was to collapse, or to the line for that matter? Had they but pressed on a little further? Far off, it seemed, a hunting horn sounded the return almost forlornly. He was safe now, and so were the other runners, at least till the next hunt. A sigh of pained fatigue escaped him before he closed his eyes and waited silently. Even the straw he had longed for would give him no comfort during what remained of the night. His thigh was a mass of pulsing pain, inhibiting even the little movement possible within the confines of his cage. The other runners had been forced to carry him back most of the way, and the progress had been slow. This had done nothing to improve the mood of the beaters who had accompanied them, and who had little patience with an injured runner, especially one who had earned them the ire of the hunters. He had been handled roughly, despite the obvious severity of his wounds, and chased back into his cell with no sparing of the whip. The wound was clean, though, and he did not fear infection. He had used half his precious cup of water to rinse away the dried blood after unwrapping the twisted strips of tunic. Looking at the punctures in his flesh and the swelling of the muscle, he had doubts whether he would be at all fit for another hunt in 10 days, even with help from Kor. Runners were not spared or given time to recuperate when injured. If the injury rendered them useless for another hunt, they merely disappeared into the feeding pits. Had he survived the day's ordeal only to make a meal for some creature of the Torque? These contemplations helped drain his strength of will, till he knew there would be no healing sleep this night or the day to follow. Even the familiar voice could not drive back the cloud of despair.
You nearly slipped beyond my reach this day.
Yes, I am sorry. I am not worthy of your aid or patience.
All is not lost. Do not lose heart.
I cannot hope to recover in time.
Lund had to focus his mind with an effort to express this unfamiliar despondency. It was as though the emotion was too weak to formulate into a meaningful image.
Urine is on his way to you.
What could he do? The flow of blood has cleansed the wound already.
The boy had served him well when his body had carried the marks of a savage beating, but he would be of little use in such a serious matter. It would be a comfort, at least, to receive whatever provisions could be spared for a sorry runner such as himself, and the presence of a fellow slave would certainly boost his sagging composure.
He is more than I have revealed to you. The boy is a healer, but he is young. He will attempt to improve your condition. This may be too much for his strength. If he is unable to make his way back through the ducts, they will kill him, and our secrecy will be compromised.
I understand.
Lund was pleasantly surprised at these tidings. There had not been a healer in the crypts for many seasons. No wonder Kor was so taken with the boy. It had now seemed that his stupidity and carelessness would endanger another life, or perhaps lives, and possibly rob them of a much-needed means of aiding one another. His joy at having contributed to the survival of his fellow runners faded abruptly. He turned his mind to Kor.
Do not risk the boy and the passage for one runner.
I will risk it. You are one of my brightest hopes. Wake him if he should fall asleep.
A hand clasped itself round the center bar of the grate and lifted it free. Then the tousled dark hair appeared, the wide eyes, pupils dilated in the semi-dark beneath, and the slim body slid through the bars. Lurin carried 2 flasks and a bundle with him. One of the former contained water, which Lund gulped down gratefully. The other was half filled with a sweet-smelling liquid of some potency unfamiliar to him. The boy motioned to him that this had to be imbibed as well, and he hesitated only momentarily before obliging. The effect was disturbing but oddly enjoyable. The glow washed through his body, leaving a tingling sensation in its ebb. His senses were heightened, and at the same time the heaviness of pain and fatigue faded miraculously. He could only stare at the boy as the latter knelt next to him, smiling ever so slightly. Lurin stretched out his hands over the injuries, and his face hardened into a frown of concentration. Lund lay back, yielding to the lull of the extraordinary draught. There was a slight pressure, as of a careless touch on bruised flesh, and then he could feel the boy's hands tremble slightly, as they had 10 days before, yet he knew that the nervousness of then had merely been out of fear for causing more pain to an injured man. Now it was a task he did not know whether he was able to perform. It was dark, yet he sensed that the night was far spent, and ready to yield to the light of day. Had he slept? Perchance an hour or 2 had slipped by since what? He strained his thoughts to remember, for there was a sudden nagging of urgency, a neglected task of the utmost importance. Then he perceived the deep breathing of another sleeping form in the blackness.
Wake him.
It was a child, lying face down close to the grate. Was he hurt? Lund moved quickly and silently, his mind still groping for explanation, till he crouched next to the still form. The boy's head rested on his arm, facing the other way. He grabbed the shoulder roughly, the skin strikingly cold beneath his fingers, and turned him over with the intention of waking him up. The eyes flickered open, and he recognized the boy. A faint pre-dawn light crept into the cell. He remembered.
Be quick.
There was a note of extreme concern in Kor's tone. Lund spared a moment to glance down at his own right leg and the now scarred but sound muscle of his thigh. The boy was confused, drugged with deep sleep. There was a smear of dried blood on one cheek, as if from a nosebleed. Had he fallen and hurt himself? Lund leaned forward to whisper urgently.
Boy, awake. You have to return to your cell at once, or be discovered.
He motioned towards the grill that still gaped open where the middle bar had not been replaced. The dripping water was loud in the hollow space. Urine nodded as he sat up, rubbed his eyes, and turned towards the duct opening. In a moment he had lowered his body into the dark cavity. Lund placed his hand fleetingly on the head as it disappeared. His whisper followed the boy down.
Thank you, Urine.
The iron bar was corroded and rough, a testimony to hundreds of cycles of slow wear and sculpting by the constant wetness. It slid into place with a conspiratorial sigh. Lund ran both his hands over his right thigh, where the maiming injuries had been. He knew at once that the guards should not be made aware of his impossible recovery. He sat back on the straw and proceeded to wrap the blood-stained strips that he had removed but a while before round his now healthy limb. The guards had not seen the true extent of his wounds. It would be safe to remove the covering by the next hunt. It was astounding how unrelated incidents could conspire to fuel the fire of misperception, and thus contribute to a mounting pressure that, if allowed to swell unchecked, would eventually force an error from the most experienced campaigner. Lord Zabron stroked his small pointed beard impatiently. This habit he had acquired as Horan's representative in Munborg, that humid, sprawling den of traders, thieves, assassins, and traffickers of all flavors. It had been a prime location to prove one's worth and sharpen one's wits. No doubt he had profited immensely from the experience. Yet there was a discomforting, insidious quality about these wretched slaves that dwarfed the guile and dishonesty rampant in that seaside city where he had made his reputation. They had no names, no speech, no sense of identity, and thus it had been for generations. Yet he perceived a brooding conspiracy of some kind, an intelligence that was at least a guide to their actions, and has as its ultimate object, no doubt, the overthrow and annihilation of their masters. It had been thus since the very first of his forebears had withstood the favored one and his progeny, and thus it would remain until the last remnant of that spawn had been eradicated. Since the first consolidated action on the very day of his arrival, he had been aware of this plotting presence deep within the pits and crypts which the slaves inhabited as so many insects. He had been challenged from the outset, probed and measured by the way he reacted. It had been a near disaster on that first day, the open defiance, and had not been sufficiently averted as to be claimed as a victory on his side. Yes, the slaves had defended themselves against wild animals, but they would not lift a weapon against one another, a fact that had not gone unnoticed or unappreciated by the audience. His tactics against the resistant fighters, beatings and starvation, had availed little, since there had been no improvement in the entertainment this past 10th day. The pressure had mounted when, by some conspiracy of chance, not a single trophy had been bagged in the hunt that day. He was quite certain that the organized resistance had not spread to the runners as yet, for they had participated most gamely, as in the past. Or had they? He tugged at his beard again, cursing his uncertainty. Where was that wretch of an overseer? Groth's attitude of respectful servility had changed dramatically since the new master's devices had proved so ineffectual. This tardiness in responding to a summons was but one symptom. There was a firm knock at the door of his council room. He glanced up from the mesmerizing shifting of shadows in the dim torchlight on the floor, and forced his voice to project a calm confidence in bidding the knocker to enter. Here was the scoundrel at last. Groth wore heavy leather armor over his muscular frame, as was customary for overseers, and the moving light reflected briefly off the polished surface, as well as the shaven round of his head.
No success?
Zabron regretted his admittance to negative expectations immediately.
None, my lord.
There was the irritating hint of contempt again, or was it that he expected to hear it?
They will break sooner or later, Groth.
He hated saying those words, as if he was a mere overconfident greenhorn, trying to reassure himself, and he hated the big brute in front of him for hearing it.
One can affect the mind through the flesh. I have seen this.
Groth merely shrugged.
We can beat them, but we cannot make them believe. They believe their own listeners. They hide them and whisper in the dark. Filthy creatures, my lord.
They are cattle, Groth, and one does not slaughter one's possessions unless it is to one's benefit. Is that not sound?
There was a loud snort in reply.
You have not been here long enough to hate them like we do, my lord. But you will soon learn the value of killing at random. Then you must be careful that you do not develop too much of a taste for it, or the Great One would be deprived of his own sport and profits.
He grinned, displaying the sharpened fangs of a flesh-eater.
You refer to my predecessor, Lord Ishtar. Yet it is true that the slaves' numbers declined rapidly during the last 3 cycles of his rule.
As I said, my lord, you have to take care.
Groth was still smiling. Zabron suddenly grew tired of the verbal game. He forced himself to say the words he had sworn not to utter here.
What do you suggest, Overseer Groth?
It was painful watching the other smile widen a fraction more before contracting into a smug and eager line. He noticed for the first time that this man's features boasted somewhat thicker lips than was customary to their race. Could there be mixed blood somewhere in his ancestry? Groth had no particular desire to see his new master humiliated. He did, however, appreciate the opportunity offered by the changing of leadership. He would not stand in the shadow of the experienced ruler and merely follow instructions. For a few seasons, at least, his opinion would be valued.
I would...
He smiled again briefly.
You might want to rid yourself of all the fighters that put forth the challenge last 10th day. Have them slowly tortured to death in the training square, in front of the others. In the end, the remainder will wish for nothing more than a quick death in the arena. They will fight and kill each other, rather than be flayed and left to rot.
How many would be lost?
About 24.
Are they not the pick of the fighters?
Groth shrugged.
Only a few, and these are easy to replace, but it is not the end of it.
He narrowed his eyes, staring intently at his superior.
You might show your contempt for these slaves by stepping into the arena yourself.
He saw the master frown and continued hastily.
Take on as many as would be comfortable for you to slay quickly. They will be armed but unarmored, and weak with hunger, a spectacle to win the admiration of the crowd.
Groth was warming up to his topic.
Lord Ishtar had women and children brought up from the farms.
Zabron held up a hand.
I have heard that account. Those actions brought him little esteem in the eyes of the lords in Nunmerik, since he indulged in it so frequently that it hurt the production of the entire area.
Groth wore a different smile now. A pale light seemed to burn in his gaze.
Ah, but they did cast a deep shadow in the weak minds of the slaves. Ishtar was their living nightmare. Hated, yes, but also feared.
He broke into a high-pitched cackle that smacked a little of insanity, and was better suited to the hag that had probably been his mother.
They were uncertain, always in confusion, for he was unpredictable and swift in his retribution. Lord Ishtar even invented 3 new events for the arena.
It was clear that this former master was still held in reverence by his subordinates, and he had enjoyed a large measure of success with his administration. Perhaps it would not be such a bad idea to take a page out of his book in this place, however distasteful that would be to Zabron. His fingers strayed involuntarily to his beard. He stared unseeingly at the self-satisfied face in front of him. A wave of sudden weakness reminded him that it was time to end the interview.
I shall consider what you have said, Groth. There is certainly some merit in the methods of my predecessor.
He rose to his feet.
By sunset tomorrow we will embark on a new course of action. You may go.
He nodded towards the door. As soon as the overseer had turned a corner and was out of sight, Zabron set off with a purposeful step. He had been explicit in his instructions to his personal servant Bresh, who was in the habit of obeying him to the letter. The sacrifice would be ready and waiting. A quick glance behind him at regular intervals assured him of secrecy and solitude. There was complete silence in the lower chambers, and the darkness suited him well. A faint, musty odor intensified as one descended, as if the rotting residue and leaf litter of countless trees had permeated the earthen walls around him. Here it was so much easier to sift through the troubling thoughts and possibilities. That he would have to make certain allowances and corresponding adjustments to his strategy was unavoidable. Perhaps there had been clear, calculating method in Ishtar's apparent reckless madness. If he was to enjoy the time left to him here, he would have to make use of the experiences of Groth and the like, however humiliating it might be. He had been mistaken, and he would admit it to himself. This place was altogether different to Munborg. Here there was no restraint to one's whim, no politics to encumber the creative mind. The prospect excited him immensely. He passed through an arched doorway and closed the heavy door behind him. In complete darkness now, he turned the key slowly and deliberately, listening all the while. He had not been followed, of that he was sure. The only discernible sound came from the frame somewhere behind him, where he knew his servant Bresh had secured the prey. The breathing was low and even, as if the child was asleep or unconscious. He closed his eyes very tightly for a while, before he called the dark light from its brazier. The dull red glow, invisible to the eyes of other races, spilled lazily from the crystals, washed round the tethered figure and its skeletal altar, and touched the far wall of the chamber indifferently. The Lord of Grail caught his breath almost nervously as he approached. He halted before the latticed frame and looked down. Was it one of Yuka's? It resembled her, certainly, and this pleased him. Yuka was so vibrant, so alive. Good stock was all important to reach his goal. He had been warned about feeding on weak bloodlines, and that the resultant shadows could be caught between the world of the warrior and that of real power, unable to find their way back to either shore. But that would not be his fate. He was assured of a strong supply from his established house, where the concubines had been selected for purity of blood and not physical beauty. He smiled and closed his eyes again, a familiar tingle of power in his fingertips. The fog swirled impenetrably round the mottled white trunks of a stand of gala trees. The unseasonable grey blanket made hunting difficult, while at the same time the skilled runner had to rely on good fortune not to be stumbled upon by one of the many troops of beaters. Lund strained his senses to the utmost, turning his head quickly and furtively at the slightest sound, though the direction from which it had come was virtually impossible to determine. His eyes were wide and staring, his mouth open to aid his hearing, and the muscles in his legs quivered in anticipation. If he was discovered, he would not offer the hunter a clear shot for more than an instant. Hor's protection was invaluable in this situation. A practiced eye could discern the telltale markings of a set trap. Good hearing and a sharpened sense of smell might give warning of approaching danger, but the cloud of dampness yielded no more than 3 yards to the most piercing gaze. Sounds were muffled or oddly augmented and directionless, and keeping a bearing once flight was underway was not possible. Here the clear warnings in his mind kept him safe, and would prevent him from circling back unknowingly into the fatal embrace of his pursuers if he had to flee. Yet this formidable defense of his had been breached so easily during the previous hunt. The haunting image of the hunter and his bow standing so close to him but a little while before still shattered his calm, and threw off the rhythm of his running even while he trained. Now he could see the shape looming on every side. He could hear his approaching death in the creaking of every moving bough. The galahs offered little cover, but he lingered among them, for the sparse undergrowth here would allow a swift passage when he had to dash for safety. He placed a hand on the smooth bark of a young tree. There was strength in it, rooted deep in the earth. He searched for a moment for a corresponding strength within himself, but his fear was a blinding fog of its own, making it a futile quest. A sound of frustrated voices floated from somewhere to his left.
Beaters, moving past. Remain where you are.
He flattened himself against the firm wood. Though the tone was clear, no words or meaning was discernible. He could well deduce the reason for their frustration. Only good fortune would reveal the whereabouts of the runner to them, and the rounding up of the scattered prey at dusk could become a daunting task, unless the damp cloak dispersed before then. A nearby scrape of metal on stone wrenched him from his thoughts. He held his breath, listening with all his might.
Core, I do not sense. A moment.
A dark shape loomed up out of the mist, a crossbow held at the ready. Lund scurried away, twisting among the trees, the small of his back prickling in anticipation. He could not move swiftly without giving away the direction of his flight, for the slight whisper of shrubs, the shifting of leaves and small pebbles at his passing, mocked his need for silence. The grey blanket made it difficult to find the most appropriate route through the tangles and trees, and he could easily weave his way into an ambush of growth, from which he would have to double back. The fog had become an encumbrance rather than an aid, a swirling prison to the senses.
A hunter. The same one. He follows? Yes. Close.
Panic swept through his mind. This horror could track him in the mist, could sense him somehow. He had become its preferred target. This would be his last run. A thorny shrub drew blood from his leg as he hurried past, but he hardly noticed. Fear was a lump in his throat, forcing his breath to pass in shallow wheezes. He swallowed hard, feeling for the lost skill of his training, knowing he had to clear his mind and forget the terror crippling him. A wall of trees forced him to the left. There were footfalls of the booted feet of his pursuer behind, yet there had been no sighting sounded on the horn. This predator would not share his prey, or accept the aid of a team of beaters. He had confidence in his abilities to sense and track, to trap and kill. It was futile, fleeing from such a determined lust for his blood. How long would it be before his doom caught up with him? Already the fog was thinning, or did he imagine it? Was the treacherous cover that had betrayed him to the hunter now betraying him yet again to his death? A thicket of shrubs barred his way. Could he worm through, or would it slow him too much? He hesitated for a moment, willing the grayness to part, and glanced to left and right. He could not hear the footfalls behind. The bowstring twanged from somewhere, spitting its whistling death towards him. He dropped at the same time, but not before the bolt had clipped his left shoulder in searing pain, and scuttled off into the brush. He was out of the crouch and sprinting away, no longer concerned with direction or impossibility, his mind frozen with stark terror. The scratching arms broke before his onslaught, and he rolled through to scramble on all fours among the trees beyond. He swerved this way and that till the lifting fog showed him what appeared to be a deer path.
It is clear. Follow it.
He ran till his lungs were burning, and his legs ached with the effort. Then he veered off the faint track and concealed himself among the rough-barked evergreens. He gulped air like a fish, his chest heaving. There was no sound above the rapid beating of his heart.
Where is he?
I do not know.
Did he follow?
I think so. Keep moving.
Lund peered round the thick trunk he leaned against. The track seemed clear, the lingering drifts of fog less threatening. He drew his tongue over his dry lips and swallowed. How many hours were left in the day? The bolt barely grazed his shoulder, the right one this time, before burying itself in the tree, its black shaft quivering. He twisted round the trunk, almost colliding with a sapling in his mad haste, and sped away down the path. His flight was less panicky than the first, as if part of his mind had already accepted the inevitability of what would follow. Ere long he had regained enough of his rational thought to realize that the bolt had missed him on purpose. This hunter was playing with his quarry. He would kill it at his leisure once he had tired of the game. The horror of this realization at first fueled his fear, yet part of him was angered beyond measure, and briefly he tasted again the madness that had driven him to strike at the beaters. He stopped in his tracks, groping for the curved claw inside his tunic.
He will take your head.
He will take it anyway.
Kor's tone was resigned, almost distant.
Strike for his eyes. If you cannot kill him, you may disable him.
Lund turned around and trotted slowly back the way he had come. It was a strange sensation, searching for a hunter instead of hiding from him. He felt as resigned to his fate as Kor. His fear and anger had both faded, so that he sensed the nervous apprehension knotting his stomach. The hand holding the crude blade was slippery with sweat. His breathing was still fast and irregular. His chest felt hollow, half in anticipation of the murderous bolt from the crossbow. He edged into the margin of the brush, off the trail, so as not to present an easy target. If the bolt missed him, he would have a chance to get to close quarters. He forced the image of the burly, armored hunter out of his mind, in an attempt to steady his nerve. Yet his entire body was quivering as he slithered through the greenery, trying not to disturb the stems and boughs around him, and he was unduly aware of the pulsing life within him. He froze. Some 20 paces down the trail stood the hunter. He held the bow at the ready as if he expected some unusual tactic from his prey. Then he took 3 uncertain paces forward. Lund drew back, willing the shadows to make him indiscernible, since the fog had retreated almost entirely. The darkness was insubstantial and pale, however, for the overcast sky did not allow a single ray of sunlight to sharpen the contrast under the trees. He realized if the hunter would look in his direction, he would certainly be seen. A droplet of sweat limped down his nose to drip noisily onto the dark soil. He had almost reached up a hand to stop it. Now he hardly dared breathe, as the helmeted head turned, and the probing eyes surveyed every shrub and tangled thicket for a sign of life. His skin crawled as the gaze passed over the place where he was lurking. Should he rush the torque now, even if it was futile to avoid the black shaft? Should he remain where he was and trust in the meager concealment? The indecision tugged at his sanity. While he hesitated, the armored figure took a step backwards, looked away into the brush, and then, slowly and deliberately, he turned his back to his prey. Lund felt a surge of hope at this opportunity, clouded almost immediately by uncertainty. Had he done it on purpose? Did he mean to lure his quarry into the open for a clear shot? But then, would he get another opportunity like this? His knuckles were white round the talon of steel. He did not have the nerve to charge to his death. He was a whimpering slave boy in the field without a mother or father, a lost soul driven by hunger, fear, and the lash. He was a swift-running youth sworn at by the trainer, cuffed and kicked by the overseer. He was a quarry for the all-powerful hunter, a trophy for the festive hall, but mostly He was helpless fear, paralyzed in the moment of seeming good fortune, with limbs rooted in the soft ground, unable to move or think.
He offers you a chance.
A voice of light inside his head, as though his thoughts had a voice apart from his, an expression his will could not control. Had all functions slipped beyond his command? Would he kneel here, unable to rise, like the animal he was meant to be, waiting for the fatal blow to fall? He was shaking, his body a foreign thing knotted with tension, his teeth clamped together, the cold perspiration of the dead upon him. And then he was away, exploding across the pathway into the brush on the far side, even as he heard the eager thrum of the bowstring. Amazingly, there was no sharp pain or debilitating numbness in one of his limbs as he crashed through the growth on all fours. He was up and rushing at the torque, now within plain view. The bow was dropped in surprise, the blade drawn and aimed from the side in a swipe meant to take off his head. He ducked under the blow and delivered two of his own to the armored body before darting back out of reach. There was a sticky wetness in his taloned hand, where the metal had bitten into his flesh at the ferocity of his blows and the futile impact against the other's armor. It would be an unequal struggle, now that his opportunity was spent and the torque had recovered. The hunter came on with quick, powerful blows aimed at the body of the prey, which had not the means to block or parry a single one. Lund used the trees as cover, half falling over exposed roots in an effort to dodge the maiming swipes. When the hunter paused, he darted under the blade to strike at him. It almost cost him his life. Anticipating such a move, the hunter brought down his blade where the exposed back of his opponent would have been, had he not drawn back at the last moment. His blow severed a stout bough from a sapling. Taking advantage of the unbalanced moment, Lund struck at his sword arm, drawing blood. There was no outcry of pain nor surprise, only an increase in the speed and intensity of the next attack. Lund backed away swiftly, partly colliding with a tree trunk behind him. For a moment he was within reach of the slicing weapon. He had to fend the steel off his ribs with his left forearm, which took the full force of the blow. There was a sickening instant when he felt it biting into the bone. Then he had rounded the trunk, blood pouring warmly from the gash and dripping through his fingers. The sharp pain angered him, but he knew that anger would avail him little. The only advantage he had was mobility, for his opponent was encumbered with armor, which at the same time made him almost unassailable with the inadequate weapon Lund possessed. He kept backing away, attacking in feints now and then to test the vigilance of his opponent. Twice more he was able to take advantage of an overtly powerful stroke to slip inside the hunter's defense. He wounded both unarmored thighs, half hoping it would hamper the torque sufficiently to allow his escape. Suddenly there was a semicircle of impenetrable thicket behind him, hedging him in. He attacked like a fiend, striking hard at the body of the hunter, and felt the jarring impact and the talon cutting painfully into the palm of his hand. His weapon could not penetrate this barrier. In close quarters the torque dealt him a vicious blow to the side of the head, with the hilt of his sword setting his ears ringing. He sidestepped to the right and hit back, parrying the claw in his opponent's upper left arm. Then he leaped backwards, feeling the point of the sword raking over his ribs. Again he struck with all his might, desperately now, the fear of death upon him. Again he felt the metal hook bite into his hand as it glanced harmlessly off the armor. His right arm was dull and aching with effort. His wounded left had lost all feeling. He had succeeded in escaping the trap, though, and broke through the fringe of the thicket wall, sweating and lead-footed with fatigue. The hunter followed closely, also breathing heavily and dripping blood on the forest floor. They were in a tiny clearing now, wearily circling each other. Flitting movements here and there on the ground caught Lund's eye. Butterflies, dozens of black velvety wings flickering with irregular purpose, their owners oblivious and unconcerned. A shallow ditch ran lengthways across the clearing, as straight as if it had been dug intentionally. Instantly Lund saw his opportunity. As soon as the hunter had his back to it, he lunged forward. He caught the torque's heavy frame in the chest with his shoulder. The latter stepped backwards, and finding no support for his foot, was sent sprawling among the dry leaves. In a moment Lund was on him, his lethal right hand searching for the throat, his left arm without power and useless, vainly trying to keep his body on top of the other, pinning him down. The Torque's sword had been struck out of his good hand, which he now closed round Lund's throat, choking him. The other weakened hand attempted to restrain his opponent's attack. Lund pressed the interfering left arm of the hunter against the ground with his claw, looking for a gap in the armor. The full-faced helmet protected the throat and neck, and would have to be removed before he could strike a death blow. His own left hand was worthless, and if he had to release the catch to remove the helmet, he would have to use his right, temporarily relinquishing his only weapon. The other's sword remained beyond both their reaches, half buried among the leaves. The fingers round his throat burned into his skin. Dark spots were marring his vision. He felt strength draining from his fingers.
His eyes.
Desperately, he released the bleeding arm, which was brought up almost immediately to fall weakly on his own right shoulder, drawing him closer still, binding him even further in the fatal embrace, and preventing any attempt to strike at the hand and arm, choking the life out of him. There was no room for him to draw back his arm and strike with any power at the head so close to his own. He scraped the claw over the metal face, searching for an opening. He felt it lodge itself, and press down with what little strength remained to him. The hunter gasped and shuddered. The fingers round his throat relaxed immediately, and in the euphoric drawing of breath he almost lost his own grip on the talon. His opponent started struggling frantically beneath him, but the proximity of their bodies now prevented him from using his good arm to ward off the attack. Instead, he could only strike weak blows with his left hand against the arm that had caused him such injury. His right arm, which had held the runner in a death grip, now tried to push him away. Lund used the sudden leverage to draw himself up. Then he leaned the weight of his upper body on the curved blade and felt it sink away. Still the hunter had no voice. He merely sighed, his limbs quivering for a moment or two. Lund released the talon that had almost embedded itself in his hand, and rolled off the dead body. Dry leaves crunched beneath his back. He spread out his arms and lay still, breathing heavily. He was alive, and the shell next to him was dead. It rang in his mind almost without meaning, yet the quick gasps in which he now drew breath could not be attributed to his bruised throat alone. He felt like laughing or crying, but both these expressions were so foreign to him that he merely continued the gasping, even as after a while he was no longer starved of air. In fact, there seemed to be too much air inside of him, for his chest was light and empty, and his mind like the sun in the blue sky.
There are beaters approaching, slowly, 2 miles away.
He sat up. An unfamiliar wetness that had welled from his eyes slipped over his cheeks. There was a glow inside of him, the sweetness of stolen sun-tide fruit, the heavy rush of taking the life of an oppressor, the cool comfort of his straw pallet after a driving day, all rolled into one. He felt all-powerful. What were beaters to him? Had he not slain a hunter? Slow, weak, unprotected, and here among the leaves there was a sword. Not too far off the crossbow lay discarded in the deer path. Could he not defend himself with these? He would arm himself with the bow, hide in the forest, and kill all who would attempt to enslave him again. He could live off the deer and the hares, perchance find his way to the edge of the wood. Was this not his only opportunity to escape? The milling thoughts intoxicated him, bringing pleasant disorder to his mind.
They will summon more hunters. You will be killed if you linger here.
No, he thought to himself. I can kill them before they sound a horn. But uncertainty flickered through his mind again, restoring some sense of reason. He rose to his feet and readied himself for the running. His left arm was a mess of throbbing pain. His body was covered in blood, at least some of it his own. He glanced at the sprawled figure, now touched by slanted strands of sunlight that had filtered through gaps in the clouds, as well as the foliage overhead. The butterflies frolicked round it energetically.
This is unforgivable. You know that.
I had no choice.
When they find you, they will break you.
They must find me first.
He was away, his legs flowing in their accustomed gait, the familiar tiredness of his body bringing its own odd comfort. Yet he soon felt tension and apprehension choke the exhilaration of a moment before, causing his muscles to contract or relax a fraction too soon or too late, preventing the smooth stride his tired limbs demanded. He forced his mind away from the fear, concentrating on regulating his breathing. At the same time he realized that his lungs were already shuddering with the strain and drawing in air in shallow gasps. He had gone barely half a mile when it became clear that the struggle with the hunter had drained away his stamina.
Stay off the path.
Lund swerved to his right, struggling through the undergrowth. Around him the shadows melted into twilight. The sun had gone down. A coldness settled on him.
Stay with me, Core.
I can stay as long as you need.
Are they close?
They have found the body. They have released the dogs.
Almost immediately he could hear the baying of the pack as they picked up his scent. He had seen more than one runner torn by these brutes, even during training. He had seen the stark fear in the eyes of his fellows when they had heard the blood-curdling peal of the pack on the loose. He had felt the overwhelming gratitude that he had not been its prey then. Now their eager wailing was for his blood. It drew the very strength out of his limbs. He willed himself onwards, though part of his mind had already resigned itself to the recapture and what would follow.